of the game.
Gunfire Reborn is what happens when you take a Chinese developer and get him to make a combination of Dead Cells, Risk of Rain 2 and Borderlands all mashed together with an art style that looks right out of a Blizzard game. Looking at this thing from a distance and then even initially playing it, it feels like one of those games that I should be linking my credit card to, spending hundreds of real dollars to buy in-game currency to spend on characters and unlockables. It looks like the type of game I should be seeing a pre-roll ad for on YouTube or something. But it's not. Instead, it's a really fun little shooter on Steam that no one seems to even talk or know about, and one that's more addictive than snorting heroin out of the back arch of a supermodel. And also, like my biological father, this thing just came out of nowhere and it did its darndest to win me over. And you know what? It succeeded, unlike a certain would-be father. Anyway, developed by a Hong Kong developer, this is a first-person roguelike shooter and an RPG where you explore somewhat randomly generated levels, collecting weapons, opening chests to find powerful scrolls and ascensions to buff your hero, along with leveling up in between runs by spending soul essences. You buy items and weapons from peddlers, you upgrade your guns with craftsmen, and you just shoot everything else. It's got a dash move because every FPS these days apparently has to have one, but otherwise it plays like a pretty standard first-person shooter, just with a whole heap of mechanics. All up in the current version of the game, there's 3 areas with 4 stages each, the 4th stage ending in a boss fight. Death is also a pretty common mechanic in this game, and yeah, you're gonna die a lot here, but you'll just get right back into it like you've got the memory of a goldfish. The reason for that is because this game is incredibly fun and addictive, and within the first 24 hours of buying it, I'd spent 12 of those playing it. Once you start playing this, you'll probably start to see the Borderlands vibe too. The shooting feels very similar, with enemies having health bars and weapons having elemental effects that work better against certain enemy types. Enemies with blue bars, for instance, means they've got a shield, which is susceptible to shock weapons. Enemies with yellow bars have armor, which are more responsive to corrosive weapons. And then once that's all been stripped off, a good fire weapon's gonna make short work of what's left. When you kill a boss, they'll even spit out weapons and loot in all directions, like oh so many of Borderlands bosses. The whole thing starts off pretty simple, mostly because the health points for enemies are so low that it doesn't really matter what guns you're using. But once you start getting into the later stages, you're going to have to really start playing smart and using these elemental effects to your advantage. Now, Gunfire supports up to 4 players in co-op, and I'd really recommend it if you can. I mean, there's nothing wrong with playing solo. I've done my best work when I'm all alone, but the thing is that the weapon limit in this game is only 2 guns. My point is that if you're carrying a fire and a shock weapon, that still means you're not going to be as effective if you come up against someone with armor. So if you're playing with a mate who's got a corrosive weapon, it's going to make things a lot easier. Not to mention, just like most things, it's more fun with a friend.
Oh my.
The only problem with co-op play currently is that if someone dies, you have to then beat the entire area before they're revived, boss and all. Now this might be fine, except that extra players multiplies a boss's health points by like 2 or 3 times. And when a player is dead, the boss's health pool doesn't go back down, so you're up against an enemy that's balanced towards 3 people attacking it. I think that Gunfire's gunplay, say that 5 times fast, is also what makes this whole thing so addictive. Like, this is some pretty damn tight shooting. Weapons are really creative visually, even though they're just basically fancy looking versions of submachine guns, assault rifles and sniper rifles. You've also got a minigun, a rocket launcher, and then what's basically a goddamn BFG. You can even unlock Mushu from Mulan and carry him around on your wrist like your very own portable flamethrower. Your starting gun is a revolver with 9 shots that actually does pretty decent damage, and it always scales with the player, along with having infinite ammo so you've got a backup in every situation. There's no iron sights here, so get used to hip firing, but some weapons like rifles and crossbows do have scopes and others have alternate fire modes. Like this shock rifle's got an alternate fire mode that drops down a circular field, and then shots that pass through that field do extra damage. Weapons are then further improved with what the game calls extractions. I mean, I think. It's kind of hard to tell because there is a bit of a sense of descriptions being lost in translation here. To be honest, the game doesn't do the best job of explaining how a lot of this stuff works, like there's combinations you can make with elements which even have unique effects, but unless I'm missing it, it was never really shown to me how these combinations work during gameplay. Basically what the game calls extractions, I think are just supposed to be buffs to a weapons, like decreased reload times, critical hit damage, and I even found a crossbow that had a chance to spawn little fireballs on top of enemies that I was shooting at, which was as broken as it sounds. To unlock all of these weapons, you just need to play the game. There's no microtransactions, battle passes, or nothing. I mean, not yet anyway. You got a pretty basic lineup to begin with, and then guns are unlocked by meeting some kind of requirement, which is usually killing a certain amount of enemies, or killing them in a specific way, like through fire damage or critical hits. This is where the game kind of reminded me of Dead Cells as well. Like, I remember Dead Cells had a pretty similar method for unlocking that game's large arsenal. One of my favourite weapons in this is a shuriken that you can throw out that does corrosive damage, along with bouncing all over the walls, and when you're spamming this thing and they're pinging all over the place, it's just pretty satisfying to watch. Enemy designs are also creative and appealing. The first boss is a giant yeti looking thing that has an introduction that's almost identical to the Bullymong from Borderlands 2. You've got what looks like those terracotta statues come to life in the first area. The second, you're in a desert because it seems all of these roguelike games have to have some kind of desert level by law. And now you're fighting lizards that throw out fireballs and bandits with sniper rifles. That's kind of part of the charm, I think, too, is just this effortless appeal that the presentation has. It's got that kind of art style you'd see in a Blizzard game like Overwatch or World of Warcraft. Probably, I think, stemming from the game's Asian developer, but it's just such an aesthetic backdrop to all of the mayhem. Currently in the game there's two heroes, a cat and a dog. Now I think the dog is called Ao Bao, though I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. And the cat, from what I can understand in the menu, is just called the Crown Prince, though he looks like an Asian version of Puss in Boots. To make things easier though, I'm just going to call them Catman and Dog Boy. Right, so Catman is simple enough, and he's the first one you get to play. His abilities are pretty straightforward. Like Dog Boy, he can use any weapon he comes across, and his first ability is what looks like an acid bomb, but is actually a corrosive smoke grenade. You throw this thing out and it applies a damage over time debuff to enemies unlucky enough to inhale it. It's kind of like a fibrous, broccoli-laden fart. It affects all who go too close. The other ability is an energy orb, which he throws out in a straight line, able to lock enemies in place for a couple of seconds, along with doing some pretty tight damage. With a second player, you can use this to effectively lock down tougher opponents and single them out. Now Dog Boy is the same, but then kind of different. For starters, he's not available to play until you've hit level 30, which is something that took me about 5 hours to get to, so keep that in mind. Along with being a good boy, this guy's also an explosive expert, able to throw out a grenade instead of the smoke bomb, which just detonates on impact, doing base damage. But more importantly, his skill is being able to dual wield weapons, at which point you turn into the Gunzerker from Borderlands 2. With weapons in each hand, you become pretty damn overpowered, shredding through some of the bosses, but also just giving you a lot more DPS against the standard enemies. It also opens up a whole new aspect to the gunplay because you can hold different elemental weapons in each hand. Keep a shock weapon in the left hand and a corrosive weapon in the right, saving you from having to swap back and forth in combat. Now the scrolls and ascensions is where you can really start to customize these heroes, making them work for your particular playstyle. Scrolls are upgrades that cover more general mechanics like increasing your movement speed or the cooldown on your dash move. Aside from finding these in chests, there's also hidden vaults, which are portals behind weak walls you can move through to complete challenges and even more encounters. Ascensions, though, are what relates to the hero you're playing as. Now, these are upgrades for your specific skills, broken down into 3 categories. Again, kind of reminding me of the scrolls in Dead Cells. With the energy orb, for instance, you can get ascensions that make it hold enemies in place for 2 or even 4 seconds longer. You can make it so the orb has a chance to detonate multiple times, or just increase the amount of charges it has before cooldown. The smoke grenade ascensions are really useful too, tapping into the elemental mechanics of the gunplay. You can really use these to your advantage now, making it so enemies under the smoke grenade's effect take increased damage and a bunch of other debuffs that heavily swing things in the player's favour. With Dog Boy, his ascensions are focused more towards his dual wielding skill and grenades. You can even increase the dual wielding duration to the point where it keeps getting extended for every 20 shots you take. At one point I even had it going for well over a minute. There's even an achievement for it. During the boss fight in the second level, I had it active the entire time. This poor desert lobster didn't even know what the hell hit him. For his grenades, you can make it so they do increased damage, you can hold a higher capacity, or even being able to throw out 2 at a time instead of 1. It just becomes laughably overpowered. And that's really the whole good and the bad thing about this game in its current state, is the balancing or the often lack thereof. The difficulty spikes in this thing often come out of nowhere, like someone's just done a drive-by and slapped you in the face with a wet fish. You're just left standing there wondering what the hell it was that hit you. There's definitely problematic enemies. Problematic, can I still say that in 2020? And there'll be times when you've got a full shield and health, but then in the blink of an eye, you'll just lose all of it. I mean, look, it's kind of what you'd expect for a game that's been out for barely a week, but it is going to be a bit of a turn-off, I think, for some players. One of the most important skills you've got in this game is the dash move, and you can pretty much always avoid damage if the timing is right. Emphasis on the word timing here. The first boss, for instance, I think initially is just going to tear you in your asshole. You'd swear he's attacking you with bridges for hands or something because of just how long his hitbox is. But then once you get that timing down, it just becomes trivial. The dash move distance seems short, but it's short for a reason. It's encouraging skillful play and memorizing the timing and patterns of enemy attacks. Spamming that dash move over and over like you're having a seizure on top of the shift button isn't going to work well. Also, a lot of the basic enemies in this game still hit you really hard. Those lizards you come up against in the second area throw fireballs that do AoE damage for a good 5 to 10 seconds. And if you're hit by one of those things directly, well, let me just say I hope you've got all of your affairs in order. Still, you are going to need to upgrade your hero, or else you're going to be moving up shit creek backwards without a paddle. Now, upgrading isn't really going to make you invincible, but it's just going to give you a bit more leeway when it comes to the amount of stuff you can get away with. Throughout each run, you're always collecting soul essence from killed enemies, and once you've got enough soul essence, you can then use it to spend on a couple of dozen different skill trees at the end of a run. And there's just so much stuff here to unlock, it's like looking at some kind of corporate slideshow or something. It's overwhelming. It's really just kind of tapping into that grindy aspect of these kind of shooters, and let me just say, you're not going to be maxing this thing out anytime soon. After 15 hours of game time, I'd barely scratched the surface. There is upgrades to try to lessen the grind though. You can make it so you carry across more of these souls at the end of each run instead of having to lose the ones you don't spend, along with upgrades that allow the bosses to drop more essence. So on the one hand, you're getting a whole lot of value out of the whole thing, but then on the other, it can come across as grindy and repetitive. I guess it's just up to the player's perspective as to which way they want to look at it. I think the major issue the game has, which again isn't really its fault, just that it's an early access game, is that it's really light on the environments. I think it would definitely benefit from having a route system like Dead Cells where you can choose which area you want to go to next. And obviously it also needs way more characters to play as. As much as I love Dog Boy and Catman, they are starting to get a bit old. I'm surprised too though how Gunfire is still packed with so many little quality of life features. Like for instance, if another player walks in front of you, you can still shoot and throw grenades through them without them bouncing back and hitting you in the face like it does in Borderlands. Their player model's also going to become transparent so you can see through them as well, making it even easier. Loot is also unique to every player, so you don't have to worry about people rushing in and scooping up the best loot that's dropped or that's come out of a nearby chest. You can take your time and examine something at your own pace, and if you do want to share an item with someone, you can easily drop it for them to pick up.
Anybody want the Mushu Dragon?
Hell yeah. Sure do.
There you go.
To be honest, lag was a bit of an issue during some of our co-op games, which might have been client-side, it's kinda hard to tell. But I can excuse it for the moment, seeing the game is still in its infancy, so yeah, I'm willing to let it slide. I don't expect a little indie game to have dedicated servers or anything. At the time I made this video, I had close to 20 hours of game time and I still hadn't managed to beat the whole thing. And even though there's not all that much content in the game, even in its current state, there's just so much to enjoy here. It's full of character and charm, it has satisfying gunplay, addictive gameplay, and a whole lot of replayability. If you're not a fan of difficult roguelikes and don't like the prospect of having to restart an entire run due to a death that was probably your fault anyway, then this is probably not the game for you. But as far as games go that let you shoot mythical creatures as a gun and a magic-wielding dog or cat, it's really unrivaled and it should be treasured at all costs. You can pick it up on Steam at the moment for $17 reduced, and if you ask me, that's damn good value.